Out in the wilderness, a single dad with a past no one dares to question faces the unimaginable. When danger comes knocking, will he protect everything he loves, or will the ghosts of his old life finally catch up to him? Let us know in the comments section below where you're tuning in from and what you would have done. Anthony Stuart tightened the final bolt on the old wooden fence, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool mountain air. His hands, thick and scarred, moved with a precision honed over decades, a different kind of craftsmanship from the days he wore combat gear and spoke in code over radios. Life was simple now, chopping wood, fixing fences, raising Emily, protecting what little they had built after the world he once knew crumbled behind him. Inside the cabin, laughter spilled through an open window, faint but clear enough to stir something deep inside him. Emily, 10 years old and fearless, was trying to teach Duke, their German shepherd, and Anthony's old military canine a new trick. The clatter of a chair tipping over was followed by a bark and more giggling. He allowed himself a small smile, the kind that softened his weathered face only when she wasn't looking. This cabin, hidden among towering pines, was supposed to be the start of something new. No neighbors for miles, no distractions, no enemies. That was the promise he made himself when he signed the deed. Yet promises had a way of being broken, sometimes by others, sometimes by the ghosts in your own head. Anthony straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and scanned the tree line out of habit, the soldier in him always alert, always suspicious. To anyone else, the thick wall of trees looked serene. To him, they were 100 different places to hide. His instincts hadn't dulled. He had just convinced himself that no one would come looking for a ghost. He was wrong. Miles away, 3 men crouched behind a fallen log, binoculars trained on the Stuart cabin. They were the kind of men who survived by taking what wasn't theirs. Drifters, criminals, men with a hunger that civility had long since abandoned. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a snake tattoo slithering down his neck, lowered the binoculars and smirked. "This is it, boys. Middle of nowhere. No neighbors. No police." His voice was rough, like gravel under a truck tire. "Easy pickings." One of the younger men shifted uneasily, his greasy hair sticking to his forehead. "Looks like someone lives there, though." "You sure?" Snake Neck laughed under his breath. "Single dad and a kid, from what I can tell. Ain't nobody gonna stop us. In and out before sunset." Their plan was simple. Scope it out today, strike tomorrow, load up whatever they could find, food, gear, maybe even the truck, and disappear into the woods before anyone ever knew they were there. Back at the cabin, Anthony leaned the hammer against the porch and called inside. "Emily, come grab your boots. We're heading down to the creek." From the open doorway, Emily popped her head out, her long brown hair tangled from her morning adventures. "Can Duke come too?" "It looks smarter than he had," and he nodded, whistling for the old dog. Duke bounded out, tail wagging like he was still a pup, though the gray on his muzzle said otherwise. As they made their way down the winding trail, Anthony's mind wandered. He thought about the life he once led, the missions that required silence, shadows, and the art of making yourself invisible. Men like him weren't supposed to settle down. They weren't supposed to raise daughters or teach dogs new tricks. They were supposed to die young or live alone. Somehow, against the odds, he had carved out something almost resembling normalcy. But normalcy was an illusion, and deep down, Anthony Stuart knew better than anyone that peace never lasted. Halfway to the creek, Duke suddenly stopped, ears perked, body rigid. Anthony dropped into a crouch instinctively, pulling Emily gently behind him. His hand moved to his belt. No weapon. He hadn't carried one today. He cursed himself silently. "What is it, Daddy?" Emily whispered, clutching his sleeve. Duke growled low, his nose pointed uphill toward the trees. The hairs on the back of Anthony's neck prickled. Movement. Brief. A flash of dark clothing among the trunks. Someone watching. Someone too close. He rose slowly, keeping his voice calm for Emily's sake. "We're heading back to the cabin. Stay close." Anthony didn't run. Running made you pray. He kept a steady, deliberate pace, his mind already shifting into a mode he thought he left behind when he packed away his uniform. He needed to know how many there were, what they wanted, and most importantly, what they were willing to do to get it. Behind him, Duke kept glancing over his shoulder, a silent warning Anthony didn't need. When they reached the cabin, Anthony secured the door with a deadbolt, pulling down the blackout curtains they only used during bad storms, or when he wanted the world to forget he existed. Emily watched him, her young face pale and uncertain. "Daddy, what's wrong?" He knelt in front of her, smoothing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Just some hikers, sweetheart, probably lost, nothing to worry about. But I want you to stay inside today, okay?" Emily nodded slowly. Duke sat at her side like a sentinel, reading the tension in the room like a book. Anthony moved to the old oak trunk at the foot of his bed, the one Emily wasn't allowed to open. He lifted the heavy lid and stared at the contents. A disassembled rifle, ammunition, a black knife with a worn handle, and a battered set of dog tags. He picked up the knife first, weighing it in his hand. His reflection stared back at him from the polished steel. A face he barely recognized. Lines that hadn't been there before. Eyes that had seen too much. Anthony Stuart hadn't been Anthony Stuart when he first learned how to survive. Back then, he was just another number in a unit designed to go where angels feared to tread. But those skills didn't fade. They waited, like old friends, like old enemies. Carefully, methodically, he began assembling the rifle, the familiar clicks and snaps almost musical in their rhythm. It was a song he hadn't played in years, but today it felt inevitable. Out there in the woods, someone had made a terrible mistake. They thought they found a helpless man in a lonely cabin. They were wrong. Anthony Stuart wasn't helpless. And tomorrow, they would find out exactly what that meant. Anthony Stuart set the rifle down on the table, his hand steady but his mind racing through the possibilities. He had been out of the game for years, but the instincts buried deep within him stirred like embers catching a fresh gust of wind. He checked the window again, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the front yard. Emily was upstairs working on her drawing like nothing was wrong, but Duke sat by the door, his ears twitching at every subtle noise the forest made. There was a knock at the door. Not a loud one, not the kind someone made when they needed help. It was soft. Testing. His body moved before he could even think, lifting the rifle and moving toward the wall beside the door. He didn't speak. He didn't warn. Words were useless against certain types of men. Through the peephole, a simple lens he had installed himself after moving in, he saw a figure standing there, dressed in muddy jeans and a worn jacket, pretending to look casual, but failing. The man knocked again, glancing over his shoulder, nervous, checking to see if anyone was watching. Anthony stayed still, watching. Finally, the man gave up and walked off the porch, disappearing around the side of the cabin. Anthony moved fast, grabbing a small radio off the shelf. It was old, military grade, but it still worked. He spoke into it with a voice low and even, his breath controlled. 3 targets confirmed. 1 tried the front, others likely flanking. The radio crackled back in response, but there was no reply. That was fine. He wasn't sending a message to anyone else, just recording his thoughts. A habit burned into him from years of solo ops. He turned and headed for the stairs. Quietly, step by step. Emily looked up from her drawing when he entered her room. Crayons scattered across the floor like the aftermath of a tiny, colorful explosion. "Daddy, are we still going fishing later?" she asked, her voice full of hope. He knelt down beside her, brushing a hand gently across her hair. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetie. Right now, I need you to do something very important for me." She blinked up at him, her brown eyes wide and trusting. "I need you to go to the closet, crawl inside, and stay very quiet. Pretend you're playing hide-and-seek, okay? Duke will stay with you." Emmeline's smile faltered, but she nodded. She had always been a smart kid. Anthony opened the closet door, revealing the small, cozy space he had secretly reinforced months ago. Steel panels hidden behind the wooden slats, just in case. "Take this," he said, handing her a flashlight. "Only turn it on if you have to, and no sound, not even a whisper. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, Daddy," she whispered. Duke followed her in, settling at her feet like a silent guardian. Anthony closed the door gently, tapping twice in a signal they had practiced but never needed. Until now. He moved back downstairs, the rifle snug against his shoulder, every sense on high alert. The front door was still shut, the windows locked, the chimney flue closed. But he knew better than to think a locked door would stop the kind of men who had chosen today to test him. There was a creak on the back porch, then another. Anthony moved toward the kitchen, the rifle leading the way. Through the thin curtains he saw a second man, taller than the first, working on the back door with a crowbar. Amateurs, loud, sloppy. He could end it now, a shot through the door, quick and clean. But that wasn't the plan. He needed to know how many there were. He needed them close, inside. He retreated to the living room, his feet making no sound on the worn floorboards. The coffee table was pushed aside, giving him a clear line of sight to the main hallway. He crouched low behind the heavy leather couch, heart rate steady, breathing control. The back door cracked, a sharp snap of wood giving way. Footsteps entered the kitchen, heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. Muffled curses. A second set of steps followed, lighter, more cautious. Go inside. Anthony waited, muscles coiled tight, the weight of the rifle comforting against his hands. The men whispered to each other, arguing about where to search first. Their voices were close enough now that he could smell the sweat and adrenaline rolling off them. And then a third figure stepped into the living room. Anthony recognized him immediately from the binoculars earlier, the leader by the way the other two deferred to him. The confidence in his body language, the arrogance that came from too many easy victories. Snake Neck smirked, scanning the room. His hand rested casually on the butt of a pistol tucked into his waistband. "Nice place," he muttered, running a gloved finger across the mantel. "Real cozy. Shame it's about to get emptied." Anthony didn't move. He waited until Snake Neck turned his back. Then he struck. The butt of the rifle connected with the back of the man's knee, dropping him like a stone. Before Snake Neck could scream, Anthony clamped a hand over his mouth and dragged him behind the couch, the rifle's barrel pressed hard against the man's temple. Sound," Anthony hissed in his ear, "and you don't wake up." Snake Neck froze. Anthony could hear the other two moving through the kitchen, oblivious. Quickly, he used a zip tie from his pocket to bind Snake Neck's wrists, gagging him with a torn strip of cloth. Then he dragged him into the coat closet by the front door and locked it from the outside, jamming a chair under the knob for good measure. On down, and melted back into the shadows, moving toward the kitchen. He needed the element of surprise. He needed to control the fight. The taller man, still wielding the crowbar, was rifling through drawers, scattering utensils and old mail. His partner was examining the gun rack on the wall, finding only empty brackets. Anthony never kept weapons out in the open. It was bait. Anthony stepped into the doorway. "Looking for something?" he asked, voice cold and measured. Both men spun around, shock flashing across their faces. The crowbar guy swung first, a wild, clumsy arc. Anthony ducked it easily, slamming the butt of the rifle into the man's ribs with a bone-cracking sound. The man dropped the crowbar and folded to the floor, gasping for air. The second man went for his waist, fumbling for a knife. Anthony didn't give him the chance. He surged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. The knife clattered to the floor. Anthony followed through with a brutal elbow to the man's face, sending him sprawling across the counter, blood blossoming from his nose. Within seconds, it was over. Anthony stood over them, the rifle aimed, but steady. "Bad choice," he said, his voice low and final. The taller man whimpered, clutching his side. The other just stared up at him. hatred burning in his bloodshot eyes. Anthony kicked the knife away and zip-tied them both, hauling them roughly into the living room where Snake Neck thumped uselessly against the closet door, trying to free himself. 3 men, all accounted for? Brumel. But Anthony knew better than to think these were the only ones. Out there, somewhere, others might be waiting, watching, planning. He couldn't afford to sit back and hope they stayed away. He had to take the fight to them. Anthony Stuart looked down at the 3 men struggling against their bonds, then turned his gaze toward the darkening window. This was only the beginning, and he was just getting started. The first rock shattered the window just after midnight, the jagged crash slicing through the thick silence like a gunshot. Anthony didn't flinch. He crouched low by the front door, rifle in hand, eyes trained on the tree line illuminated by the pale light of the crescent moon. The shadows moved out there, but they weren't hiding anymore. No, they wanted him to know they were coming. They wanted fear to creep into the walls of his home. It wouldn't work. Emily and Duke were hidden in the reinforced closet upstairs, the heavy door locked from the outside to buy them time if things went south. Anthony had made sure she had a flashlight, a few protein bars, and strict instructions. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. Not until he came for her. Only him. Another crash, this time from the back of the cabin. Glass again. They were surrounding him. Anthony's mind was calm, methodical. Years of operations in worse conditions than this had stripped fear from his bones and replaced it with discipline. Fear was a luxury for people who didn't know what to do. He did. He moved along the wall to the back of the living room, keeping low. Through a gap in the curtain he caught a glimpse. 3 men approaching from the north. One of them dragging a sledgehammer across the ground like some medieval executioner. They thought brute force would win this. They hadn't done their homework. Anthony slipped silently toward the kitchen, the route he'd already prepared. He moved the heavy wooden kitchen table aside with one swift shove, revealing the trap door beneath. It led to a shallow crawl space under the cabin, tight, cold, and perfect for a man who knew how to use darkness like a weapon. Before sliding into the hole, he retrieved an old, battered remote from a hook beside the pantry. With a flick of his thumb, he armed the first set of defenses. Tripwires at the main doors and windows, jury-rigged to trigger flares, not explosives. No need for bodies yet, just confusion, panic, make them think twice. Anthony pulled the trapdoor closed above him, leaving the cabin above silent once more. In the pitch black of the crawl space he moved like smoke, every step careful, every movement rehearsed. He reached the far side and waited, listening. The front door cracked. Boots stomped in. Shouts, low, urgent, trying to sound brave, but betraying the nerves underneath. A flare ignited in the living room with a screaming hiss, bathing the interior in pulsing red light. Anthony smiled grimly. He knew what that light did to men who were already on edge. It made every shadow look like an enemy, every movement a threat. Gunshots rang out inside the house as one of them panicked and fired at nothing. Anthony moved. He emerged through the secondary hatch near the woodshed outside, slipping into the night like a ghost. His breath was slow and measured, controlled to avoid making puffs of mist in the cold air that might give him away. From his new vantage point, he could see them clearly now. 5 of them in total, 3 inside, 2 posted outside watching the perimeter. Not a large group, not trained, but still dangerous if he underestimated them. He wouldn't. He picked his first target, the lookout by the propane tank. Sloppy stance, weapon hanging loose in his hands. Anthony crept up, using the trees for cover until he was within striking distance. In one fluid motion he rose, wrapped an arm around the man's neck, and dragged him backward into the darkness. A brief struggle, a muffled grunt. Then stillness. When down, he laid the man quietly in the underbrush, binding his hands and ankles with more zip ties before gagging him. Alive. Not a killer unless absolutely necessary. That part of him, the one that could take a life without hesitation, was locked away for Emily's sake. Tonight it stayed locked. Unless they gave him no choice, Anthony circled around the cabin, targeting the second lookout. This one was younger, jittery, and chewing nervously on a piece of gum. His head kept jerking side to side like he expected death to come screaming out of the woods. Death came quietly. Anthony swept the kid's legs out from under him, catching him before he could hit the ground and make noise. Another zip tie, another gag, another body laid out like a forgotten bag of trash. Fishing cool. Two down. Inside the cabin, the shouting grew louder. One of them had found the upstairs staircase. Anthony's gut twisted at the thought of them even being near Emily's hiding spot. He couldn't wait any longer. He moved back toward the front door, now hanging loose on its broken hinges. As he approached, he heard a voice, thick, angry. "Where's the girl, old man? We know you got a kid. Bring her out." And he slipped through the broken doorway, silent on bare feet. The flare still burned in the corner, throwing insane, dancing shadows across the walls. One man stood in the living room, a shotgun aimed uselessly at the empty stairs. Another kicked over the bookshelf, scattering Anthony's few treasured books across the floor. The third was just starting up the staircase, slow and careful. Anthony picked his target, the man with the shotgun. No hesitation, he surged forward, striking the barrel upward as the man turned. The shotgun discharged into the ceiling with a deafening boom. Before the man could react, Anthony drove the butt of his rifle into the side of his head, dropping him like a marionette with its strings cut. The second man whirled, pulling a pistol from his waistband. Anthony fired once, the bullet slamming into the wooden floor inches from the man's feet. Not a kill shot, a warning. The man dropped the pistol and threw his hands up. The third man, the one halfway up the stairs, panicked and bolted up the remaining steps. Anthony's blood iced over. He chased after him without thinking, bounding up the steps 3 at a time. At the top, he saw the man tugging at the closet door handle, cursing under his breath. Emily was silent inside. Anthony didn't call out, didn't waste breath. He lunged, tackling the man to the floor with a brutal crash that shook the walls. They wrestled, fists flying, the man's wild punches bouncing off Anthony's iron focus. With a savage twist, Anthony pinned the man's arm behind his back and drove a knee into the small of his back, grinding down until he stopped struggling. A quick loop of rope around the wrists and ankles finished the job. Anthony hauled the man up and half-dragged, half-carried him down the stairs. The 2 surviving intruders, one disarmed, one dazed, were herded together at the base of the stairs. 3 men, bound, defeated, and still, Anthony wasn't breathing hard. He stood over them, eyes cold and hard, rifle loose but ready. "You came to the wrong house," he said quietly. The man with the split lip, the one who'd been closest to Emily's door, spat blood onto the floor. "You're dead, old man. You don't even know who we work for." Anthony stepped closer, lowering his voice to a growl. "I don't care who you work for. I only care that you've made the biggest mistake of your miserable lives." One of the others whimpered. Outside, the forest seemed to press in closer, as if nature itself was listening. Anthony knew there might be more. He knew this might not be over. But tonight, Anthony Stuart reminded them, and himself, that he was not a man who could be threatened, intimidated, or broken. And anyone who tried to hurt his daughter would learn that lesson the hard way. He tightened the grip on his rifle and stared into the night, ready for whatever came next. Because the wolves were already here, and he had no intention of running. Anthony Stuart dragged the last of the intruders out into the dirt clearing in front of the cabin, their wrists and ankles bound tight, mouths gagged with strips torn from their own shirts. The 3 men struggled against their restraints, but they weren't going anywhere. Anthony was thorough. He had spent a lifetime learning how to make sure of things like that. Now, as he stood over them, rifles slung across his chest and the cold moonlight painting everything in harsh shades of silver and black, he realized it wasn't over. Not yet. These were the pawns, the expendable ones. Anthony could smell it on them, could see it in their eyes, the desperate flickers of loyalty born not of respect but of fear. Someone else had sent them. Someone who would not forgive this failure. Which meant Anthony's family wasn't safe until he took the fight to whoever thought they could reach into his life and rip it apart. He wasn't going to wait for them to regroup. He wasn't going to give them the chance. Anthony knelt down beside the one who looked the most scared, the youngest, the one who kept shifting his weight like he was trying not to soil himself. He ripped the gag free with a jerk. The young man sucked in a breath but said nothing. Smart, but not smart enough. Anthony leaned in, his voice low, steady, and cold. "Who set you?" The young man shook his head rapidly, eyes wide. Anthony pulled the combat knife from his belt and pressed the flat of the blade against the man's cheek, letting the cold steel do the talking. "You think you're scared now," Anthony whispered. "If you don't start answering my questions, you're going to wish you only had me to worry about." The young man whimpered, swallowed hard, and nodded. "Raymond Trent?" he croaked, the name tumbling from his lips like a confession. "Boss. Runs the southern end of the county. Guns, drugs, whatever he can move. Heard you had supplies up here. Thought you were some off-grid hermit." Anthony's eyes narrowed. Raymond Trent. The name wasn't familiar, but the type was. A man who built his empire on fear, who thrived in places where law was just another word for whatever you could buy. The world never ran out of men like Trent, and Anthony had spent enough of his life dismantling their operations brick by bloody brick. He stood up slowly, sliding the knife back into its sheath with a soft click. "Where is he?" Anthony asked. The young man hesitated, his fear warring with whatever scraps of loyalty he had left. Anthony stared him down, unblinking. "West side of Haven Creek," the man said finally, his voice cracking. "Old mill house. It's fortified? Guards, cameras? You can't just walk in?" Anthony smiled grimly. "Good," he said. "Wouldn't be any fun if it were easy." He regagged the man and moved swiftly, hauling all three intruders into the back of his battered old truck. He tied them down so tight they wouldn't be going anywhere even if the truck rolled off a cliff. Anthony wasn't taking any chances. He left a short, simple note taped to their foreheads, addressed to the sheriff, who he knew would find them at dawn when the patrol came through. The sheriff wasn't perfect, but he was one of the few left who hadn't sold out to men like Trent. Anthony was counting on him to do the cleanup. By the time the truck rolled to a stop near the old dirt trail leading to Haven Creek, the sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. Anthony killed the engine a quarter-mile from the mill house and got out on foot, his gears strapped tightly to his body. He moved like a shadow across the landscape, silent, methodical, a ghost slipping back into the old habits he'd buried for Emily's sake. The mill house came into view, an ugly hulk of rotting wood and corrugated steel, surrounded by chain-link fences and rusted-out cars. Spotlights swept across the yard in slow, lazy arcs. Two men sat by a burn barrel near the front gate, laughing and passing a bottle back and forth. Anthony circled wide, noting the security cameras rigged sloppily to the corners of the building. Amateurs. Technology didn't make you smart, it just made you lazy. He skirted the edge of the fence, found a blind spot, and slipped inside like smoke. He crouched behind an old tractor and surveyed the scene. 3 guards visible. 2 more inside, probably. Maybe more upstairs. Good. He preferred it when they bunched up. Easier to break 'em all at once. Anthony waited for one of the guards to wander away from the fire, bottle in hand, headed toward the tree line to relieve himself. He moved in silently, grabbed the man by the neck, and yanked him into the shadows. A quick chokehold, a soft thud against the dirt. No more sound. 2 guards left by the barrel, still oblivious. Anthony reached into his pack and pulled out a smoke grenade, old but reliable. He yanked the pin and lobbed it toward the burn barrel. The grenade popped with a soft thunk, spewing thick white smoke that billowed out fast, swallowing the yard in seconds. Shouts erupted, confused, angry. Anthony used the cover to move fast, darting toward the millhouse door. One of the guards stumbled toward him through the smoke, coughing and cursing. Anthony struck him low, sweeping his legs out, and drove a hard knee into the man's gut. As the guard folded, Anthony struck the side of his head with the butt of the rifle. Down. Out. Inside the mill house, chaos reigned. Men shouted to each other, blind and panicking. Anthony slipped through the door, rifle raised. The inside was worse than he expected. An ugly labyrinth of broken machinery, old office furniture, and rotting crates stacked to the ceiling. The stench of oil, rust, and something fouler filled the air. A figure moved ahead, gun raised blindly. Anthony took the shot without hesitation, dropping the man with a clean, non-lethal round to the leg. The man screamed and collapsed behind a desk. Another figure lunged from the left, wild, desperate. Anthony caught him just before he flipped him over a battered table with brutal efficiency. He didn't even glance back as the man groaned and lay still. At the center of the mill house was a rickety staircase leading up to an office loft, where dim light flickered through cracked glass. Anthony moved carefully, every step silent, every nerve on fire. He reached the stairs, listening. Footsteps above, and a voice. "You think you can take me?" It was loud, blustering, the voice of a man who ruled with fear but had no idea what to do when it came knocking at his own door. Anthony went up fast, low, rifle raised. At the top he kicked the door open. Raymond Trent stood behind a metal desk, a pistol in his hand, his face red and bloated with anger. Behind him, stacks of cash and boxes of ammunition were piled high. "You must be the ghost," Trent sneered, trying to hide the shake in his hands. "They said you'd come." Anthony stepped into the room, calm, cold. "You sent men to my home," Anthony said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You took what's mine," Trent barked. Anthony's smile was slow and grim. "You made a mistake." Trent raised the gun. Anthony moved faster. 2 shots cracked the air, the first Trent's, wild and high. The second, Anthony's, precise and punishing, punching the pistol out of Trent's hand and sending him sprawling backward into the wall. Anthony crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Trent by the front of his shirt and slammed him against the steel filing cabinet. "You don't touch my family," Anthony growled, every word a blade. "You don't come to my home. You don't get to walk away." Trent struggled weakly, blood dripping from his hand where the bullet had grazed him. Anthony let him drop to the ground where he lay whimpering like a beaten dog. Anthony pulled out his radio, the same battered piece from years ago, and keyed the emergency band reserved for the county sheriff's office. "This is Stuart. Location, Haven Creek Mill House. Multiple suspects request immediate pickup." The reply crackled through a second later. "Copy that, Stuart. Units en route." Anthony clipped the radio back onto his belt and looked down at Trent, broken and pathetic. It was over. But for Anthony Stuart, this wasn't just about survival anymore. He was about making sure no one ever dared threaten his daughter or his home again. And he would burn down the whole world if that's what it took. The red and blue lights of the sheriff's cruisers bathed the mill house in a surreal glow as dawn broke over the horizon. Anthony Stuart stood just outside the battered door, arms folded across his chest, watching silently as deputies cuffed the last of Trent's men and loaded them into the waiting vehicles. Trent himself, bruised and broken, was hauled out on a stretcher, a deputy standing close enough to make sure he didn't try anything stupid. Anthony didn't move, didn't say a word as the law finally did what it was supposed to do. He didn't need to. His work was already done. Sheriff Cal Matheson approached slowly, his hat pulled low against the rising sun. He was an old-school kind of man, rough around the edges, but Anthony respected him. Cal gave a nod of quiet approval as he came up beside him. "You didn't leave much for us to do," Cal said, scratching his chin. "Hell, Trent's been a thorn in our side for years. You gift-wrapped him for me." Anthony shrugged lightly, still scanning the clearing out of habit. "Just cleaning up my yard," he said. Cal chuckled under his breath, the sound gravelly. "You know I should be chewing you out for not calling earlier. But I figure when a man defends his own, and does it this clean, maybe it's best to say thank you instead." Anthony finally turned to look at him. "Just make sure they stay locked up." Cal nodded firmly. "You have my word. Judge Miller's a hard ass. He's been waiting for an excuse to crush these boys." Satisfied, Anthony gave a small nod. He glanced at the truck, still idling nearby, where the last 2 guards from his cabin were also being loaded in, still zip-tied, still humiliated. They wouldn't forget him any time soon. But the only thing Anthony cared about now was getting back to Emily. Without another word, he turned and headed for his truck. The engine grumbled to life under his hands, and the old beast rumbled down the back roads toward home. Every bump and jolt in the road brought with it a new wave of exhaustion, the adrenaline finally bleeding away, leaving only bone-deep weariness behind. His body ached, his knuckles were raw. A fresh cut on his temple stung with every twitch of the muscles in his face, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was that his daughter was safe. When the cabin finally came into view, tucked in the golden arms of the rising sun, Anthony felt something loosen in his chest. It stood firm, sturdy, despite the shattered windows and broken door. Like him, it had been tested and battered, but not defeated. He parked in the gravel drive and climbed out, every muscle protesting the movement. His boots crunched across the ground as he made his way to the front steps. Before he could even call out, the door creaked open. Emily stood there, framed in the broken doorway, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Duke was beside her, tail wagging cautiously, sensing the change in the air. "Daddy!" he cried, running forward. Anthony dropped to one knee just in time to catch her as she hurled herself into his arms. He squeezed her tight, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the warm, familiar smell of her shampoo and the faint soap she always insisted on using after playing outside. He held her like he could never let go. "I'm here, baby," he whispered, voice cracking. "I'm here. You're safe." She pulled back slightly, studying his face with worried eyes. "You're hurt." "Just a scratch," he said with a grin that hurt to make but came from somewhere real. "You did good, Em. You stayed hidden, just like we practiced." Her lip trembled for a moment, then she smiled bravely. "Duke stayed with me the whole time. He didn't even bark." Anthony ruffled the dog's fur, feeling a wave of gratitude for the old soldier who had stayed loyal through it all. "You're both my heroes," he said. Emily's arms tightened around him again, and Anthony let himself sit there for a long time, just holding her, feeling the heartbeat against his chest that made everything he had done and everything he had been willing to do worth it. Later, after he boarded up the windows and patched the broken door as best he could, they sat together on the front porch, Emily wrapped in a thick blanket, Duke curled up at her feet. Anthony nursed a cup of coffee, his sidearm resting on the table beside him, not because he expected trouble anymore, but because old habits died hard. The forest was quiet again, peaceful. Anthony knew it wouldn't last forever. Life didn't promise safety. It didn't promise anything at all. But for now, in this moment, he let himself believe it would. For her sake. For his. He glanced down at Emily, who was sketching something in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What are you drawing?" he asked. She looked up and grinned, holding the notebook up for him to see. It was a rough but clear picture of the cabin, Duke on the porch, and Anthony standing tall beside it, a rifle slung over his shoulder like a protector from the old stories she loved so much. Anthony chuckled, a low, rough sound that felt almost foreign after the night he'd had. "Looks like a pretty tough guy," he said, tapping the figure she'd drawn of him. Emily nodded seriously. "He's the bravest man in the whole forest." Anthony swallowed hard against the lump rising in his throat. He reached out and ruffled her hair again, feeling the sting of emotion he couldn't hide from her, not really. She always saw right through him. "You're the bravest girl," he said quietly. "And this cabin? Our home? It's ours. Nobody's ever taking it from us." She beamed at him, that gap-toothed smile that made everything else fade away. The day wore on, and neighbors eventually came by, more than he expected considering how far apart they lived out here. Word traveled fast in small towns. even through the trees. They brought boards, nails, food, offers of help. They didn't ask many questions, and Anthony didn't offer answers. In the eyes of the townsfolk, he'd done what any man ought to do when his family was threatened. He defended them. No medals, no ceremonies, just respect. The kind that mattered. By sunset, the windows were patched, the locks reinforced, and a fire crackled in the hearth inside. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug, Duke's head resting in her lap, both of them dozing as the warmth of the flames filled the cabin with life again. Anthony stood at the window, looking out over the darkening woods, the weight of the rifle in his hands familiar but not burdensome. Not anymore. It was simply a reminder of who he was, of what he was willing to do, and of what he had to protect. The world beyond the trees would keep spinning, filled with men like Raymond Trent. Anthony knew that. But he also knew something they didn't. He wasn't just a retired special ops commander anymore. He was something far more dangerous. He was a father, and for his daughter, for their home, for the little piece of peace they'd carved out in a world gone mad, Anthony Stuart would fight 1,000 battles and never back down. Out in the darkness, the forest stood silent and still, as if bowing to the man who had proven he would not be moved. Inside, by the light of the fire, Anthony finally allowed himself to breathe easy. They were home, and they were safe. They were good,